Kashbitmaas is the name of the house. We don't call our stakum, our families, by clans. Mine is the house that's rich with the oil rendered from the seal and the whale. I come from a whaling ancestry. The last whales harpooned, or as it would be described by our whale hunters, it's not so much the prowess, the skill, the strength of the whaler. It's that the petitioning was successful. The months spent fasting and praying and preparing so that the whale would respond by grabbing the harpoon so that it would transform itself into the resources needed to sustain life in the village. That's where I come from. A little fishing village, whaling village. Although we don't whale right now. I just want to make that part clear. We support our northern Inuit Indigenous brothers and sisters, and I've been invited on a whale hunt soon. And but these days it's more for cultural tourism purposes that our people are out telling stories about the rich history that we have with the whale that I'll touch on a little bit later. We are here in this moment, Nancy and I and a number of others. We took the time to travel to commemorate the 250th anniversary on October 7th, in fact, of the World Proclamation. We took this moment not only here, but back home in Canada. And I might need Nancy to come help me figure out how to move these pictures along. Are you going to do this? Definitely not the... Are you sure? You hear about his technology. You're as good as me.
Is it picking up? No, it's working.
It's good. All right. Just press that. All right. So this is what we're here to reflect on. The Royal Proclamation. It's not hard to imagine that there would have been some communication challenges back then. We think about moments now when nation states get together. There's legions of interpreters that are schooled in international diplomacy, learning the language, the nuances across cultures. Wasn't the case at that time. And so we begin there. We begin with the first interactions that were taking place, the relationships that have been struck up with those who were plying the waters and traveling to the lands of my ancestors, and perhaps some of you, the ancestors, traveled over there at that time. The Royal Proclamation was both a reflection of the reality of military alliances, the shedding of blood, and warfare that was taking place, the strategic alliances that were created. But for our people, the reason why we traveled back to London and our delegation laid wreaths in commemorating the veterans and the many battles that have been fought in solidarity with the UK over the course of history, a recognition of the military alliance, but also the very first, what many of our people would suggest, is acknowledgement of our land rights as Indigenous peoples. As was mentioned, we're approaching 1 million Indigenous peoples in Canada, fastest growing segment of the Canadian population, and growing rapidly. Over 50 languages, the words that I spoke, just one of 52 languages that we have across Canada. And you see the markings from the Indigenous leaders on the other side of the page. And the way that the Royal Proclamation is reflected on is the notion of the covenant chain. Traveling to London, as the elders remind us, is about polishing the chain, keeping it clean, making sure it stays shiny, that we remind ourselves of the enduring relationship with the Crown. Concepts of peace and friendship. Especially respect. That idea of seeing one another as we began. The way that would be articulated even in the way that we would acknowledge one another. The words of the Royal Proclamation coming from a foreign language, one that our people obviously didn't speak. But there was understandings that were beginning to emerge and perspectives that were expressed through the wampum belt. The wampum belt, I know that there would be many here who would understand or appreciate its significance. The idea to two canoes, two people side by side in parallel, one not interfering with the other, each other's laws, languages, customs, values, beliefs, expressions of spirituality would be recognized as needing to coexist with one another, including, as the Royal Proclamation described, that First Nations, Indigenous nations of the day would not be dispossessed of their lands, that the lands would not be taken away from them. This is an incredibly critical time in transition in North America, coming out of, as I said, the military alliances from the 7-Year War. And it was not just a French and British war. And that's, I think, one of the main themes of our visit over here. I spoke earlier about alliances of Indigenous warriors back in World War I. And there's a mutual recognition that we can find threads of. I'm going to talk about the challenges, but it's always heartening to hear about and be reminded about those relationships that they endure to this very day. That's the reason for this trip. This effort of talking about these moments is happening across Canada. We are in a significant moment of the rise of Indigenous peoples, the consciousness of these issues, not just in Canada, but globally. And I want to begin by not only thanking you for being here and inviting you into this conversation and debate, but for me, more importantly, inviting you to be a part of the action that's required at this juncture in history to address the emergence of the Indigenous peoples. I like to say we're hearkening in the age of Indigenous peoples globally. This is a very important moment. So we see these principles that were described, and I quote, it was the first written treaty that flowed from the Royal Proclamation. The Treaty of Niagara took place just a year after. And these are words that were spoken at that time, words that even in a village like mine, where we have no such treaties, we're on the very west coast of Vancouver Island. As long as the sun shines upon the earth, as long as the waters flow, as long as the grass grows green, peace will last. So these early principles that were described in the Royal Proclamation, in the Covenant Chain, in the Wampum Belt, and then the first Treaty of Niagara, after which hundreds of treaties were forged where similar concepts were articulated. That there would be mutual respect, that we would see one another, that there would be, the Royal Proclamation speaks of a third area around economics, that there would be trade and commerce, self-determination. These were concepts that, in fact, as we will discuss, have formed the very foundation of legal interactions between First Nations and the Crown, we would call the Government of Canada. And there's a direct link to the theme of the discussion here around the international aspect. These treaties are international in scope, clearly established prior to the establishment of Canada. And as such, they have a standing in international law that's been given more modern expression in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which reminds Canada, and by extension First Nations and all Canadians, whether a newly landed immigrant, a new citizen, or if a family's been there for 10 or 15 generations, that all Canadians are treaty people with an obligation to polish that covenant chain and not only understand the words of the Royal Proclamation, but in any relationship where there's love and caring for one another, what does the Wampum Belt mean? The UN Declaration updates this concept and says that the implementation of these agreements, including the principles in the Royal Proclamation, must not only be understood from the perspective through the lens of the British Crown, of the government by extension today, but of the Indigenous peoples. And therein lies the reason for a trip like this, commemorating 250 years, a moment when King George forged this Royal Proclamation, and I sent mucklucks to the current baby George as another reminder about this relationship. It's very serious for our people. When ceremonies were carried out, as they were, across the street from the statue of Queen Victoria, it's not the first time we've had chiefs like this to the statue, reminding Queen Victoria, looking up at that statue in front of the exhorting the Queen, who in this proclamation, the King had promised that the Crown would be there to ensure that the Indigenous peoples would not be harmed by the colonizing governments of the day. And it brings me to then plunge a little bit into the challenges that we have faced in the misinterpretation, misunderstanding, or the leaving behind of those early principles. Today, with emerging global economic and environmental challenges, the relationship that we as Indigenous peoples have had with nation-states like Canada, we've seen a departing from these principles. We've experienced decades of neglect on the relationship, attempted, in fact, assimilation, violence, and as is being actively debated today in Canada, cultural genocide. The challenges that we face, whether it's in a little fishing village like mine in Ahousaht, where we'll have global multinationals bringing in fish farming, for example, contrary to what's expressed in both in the treaties, the Royal Proclamation, and in the UN Declaration, overstepping our right to free, prior, and informed consent. These issues are not just local. The issues, the politics, and the economics are not just in our region any longer. They are international. And so it is that Indigenous peoples are also acting in a more international manner, speaking to settler societies in lands that we share in places like Canada, reaching back into the history of our relationship, in this case with the royal family themselves, having spent time with His Royal Highness Prince Charles, talking about these principles of interconnectedness and seeking, as the theme today is, of peace and harmony. This was always the vision, as our people understood it. Always the vision. And yet our experience has been one experiencing deep social ills and challenges between and amongst our peoples, but also in our relationship with Canada. And so we begin to examine the fundamental philosophies of Indigenous peoples that the Wampum Belt making efforts to express, the treaties brought to the fore, and that is, in my language, that we are all one, that we are all connected, that all things are living, and all living things must be respected. Even the rocks are alive and are to be treated with respect and accord. And this is a fundamental philosophy of Indigenous peoples that is being given expression around the world, including in my own home territories. I was talking to Dr. Mark, I don't know if he's in the room here, on the work that you're leading on environmental sustainability. And I've told a few of the story that Nancy and I have two children, Tyson and Tara. Our son is 27. He's elected chief and council. He went into politics. Son, I don't know about politics. But he chose to, and we support him. And both he and our daughter Tara are leading the charge on environmental sustainability. Indigenous peoples, especially young people, are helping to lead a vision forward that is around finding peace and harmony with the living environment around us. Pursuing higher learning that is focused on understanding the relationship that we have with the living environment and what we've been doing in the extraction, especially of natural resources, because Canada is such a heavy natural resource extraction economy. So I got to send out mad props, as my kids would say, to this university and Mark, your shop, for the work that you're doing, because she said, Dad, this university here in Edinburgh is the only one that I see is doing such leading work. And this is important work. Indigenous peoples, including in villages like mine, led by even children like mine, are helping to advance Indigenous viewpoints and philosophy that we describe in phrases like Hishuk Nishtawak. For any who are interested in that philosophy, we have emerging literature in Canada that includes published authors like my dad, who wrote a book called Sawa. And I would add that to your reading list if you want to consider digging a little deeper into Indigenous philosophy. John Ralston Saul, a prominent Canadian author and thinker and contributor, wrote a book called Truths About Canada, Fair Country. He argued that we should blow up every school of philosophy in Canada. That's a conversation for another day because I walked by some statues of some philosophers. So that's just a little side anecdote about the place that Indigenous worldviews will have and are having right now in the discussions on issues the likes of which we're talking about here, including economics. Over my right shoulder is His Excellency David Johnson. Some will recognize him and the work that you're doing. He is the Governor General. He's become a good friend of Nancy and I. We value he and Sharon's friendship. And to the left, Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Sharon is back there behind me. And I'm wearing my regalia from the coast. You can see it's not a feather headdress. That's often the visual that people have of Indigenous peoples in North America more broadly. We're practical people. I come from a rainforest. We measure our rain maybe like you do, by the meters, not by the inches. That's a cedar whaling chief's hat that I'm wearing. So it keeps the rain off. The cedar will tighten up if it gets a little wet. And you can see depicted on it is images of whale hunting that I was talking about earlier. And only the whaling chiefs in our villages wear that kind of regalia. And it's got the quack fur around the shoulder, sea otter fur. Just a couple of little anecdotes there. There is a presentation in a Crown gathering in January of 2012 of the wampum belt. And there was a ceremony that took place just before this occurred by some of the descendants of the original peoples of the area where the wampum belt originated from. And they had the wampum belt backwards. And they stood in front of the Prime Minister and the Governor General. And they said, this is the moment when this relationship comes back on track. And they turned it around symbolically in front of the chiefs from across Canada, saying that the direction that we've been going is not upheld the original promise of that wampum. It was really remarkable. And as I see in this picture over here, our elders led us through ceremony. Medicine was burnt and prayers were said at that moment there. So it's not only the notion of having the meetings, it's no different than the original interactions at treaty time or at the time of the Royal Proclamation. Ceremonies important. Our religious and cultural and artistic leaders are there to work with the political leaders, and it's no different when we interact today with the Crown, and that's why ceremony was done at Canada Gate across from the Palace in London on the morning of October 7th, the same time I was sitting and smoking the pipe with the current Aboriginal Affairs Minister. His name is Bernard Balfour, and we also had the leader of the official opposition. We had Tom Mulcair. And I said, on support from the elder, I said, you two need to sit on the same side of the house for this ceremony. This is a moment when you put aside the partisan ways. That's been part of our struggle and challenges, is having obviously partisan politics with the majority in Canada, overseeing the issues of relationship with First Nations when we amount to less than 4% of the national population, and when many of our people do not consider themselves Canadian to begin with, for the very reason that you've just seen. The wampum belt is about two nations. You see two figures in that particular picture. The idea of sovereignty is really a word that emerges for political description in recent generations. It probably doesn't have don't have words in our languages that describe that, but out of a fierce pride of citizenship with nations, the word sovereignty is still used. Indigenous peoples will say, I am sovereign. The Haudenosaunee will travel on their own passport and have successfully done so around the world, had other nation states recognize that they don't have to travel on a Canadian passport. His Royal Highness Prince Charles, we've become fairly close friends, and in that moment he gave me a copy of his book. I think it's called Harmony. And we were talking about, and you can see that the wampum belt is once again being presented. Ceremonies took place. That was in Toronto last spring. And I had been asked to arrange, in the time that I've been serving as National Chief, I traveled here with the spokesperson for Treaties 1 to 11. Treaties 1 to 11 covers a great swath of Canada, most of it. But the political energy to continue that treaty making, by and large, ran out with the Rocky Mountains. And as a result, places like Howsett, where I come from, do not have those same treaties. The relationship with the Crown has many in Canada Why is it that this is important? We have a prime minister. And I hope that we're beginning to demonstrate why this relationship is deeply, deeply important to us. I have to tell this story for Dr. Mark. Just looking at the image of His Royal Highness, we're sitting with the Lieutenant Governor, the Queen's representative for British Columbia. Nancy and I were at a dinner, and I was talking about the conference of the parties coming up on environment, climate change issues in Warsaw in Poland. I think it's next month. And I think many, both within and outside of Canada, know of Canada's political position that's been taken around the issues of climate change and participation or non-participation in these conference of the parties. And I saw the role of the Crown active there at this dinner when His Royal Highness was exhorting the values of Copenhagen, the Copenhagen talks, directly to the federal environment minister. So trust me, the willingness of the Crown to speak its heart and mind around issues are in fact, at that dinner, it resulted in a spilled glass of wine, and maybe I'll just leave it at that. Let's just say wine was spilled at that dinner. So you see how important these moments are. That's when Governor General David Johnson was put into office. This was the first time an Indigenous leader was asked to be present when the Queen's representative was seated by the Prime Minister. It was indeed a great honor for me to sing a song. I was in Oxford, as I mentioned, for the issue of the fisheries case. A couple pounds lighter, maybe, looking a few years younger. And but appreciative of the chance to speak to people here in Scotland and in England about these relationships, including intimate relationships, creating what we now refer to as the Métis people, one of three Indigenous peoples of Canada. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are the three constitutionally recognized Indigenous groups. And we know that there are stories of unions between Scots and Crees in the prairies and the flowing back and forth of people. We know that there are Cree Indigenous ancestry here in Scotland as well, and stories about commemorating warriors fighting side by side. And it feels like we're just recapturing that. And there's so much more that I feel will be done about that strong relationship between Scotland and Indigenous peoples, particularly in the prairies. I love hanging out with our kids. Over half of our population are under the age of 25. Children in that picture, and in pictures like this, Nancy's put together, you'll find a 10-year-old living in a 20 by 30 foot one-room home in northern Manitoba with no running water, with no electricity, and 9 people sharing that space. I see our peoples as deeply, deeply resilient. Incredible what we've overcome. And Canada is learning more about the history, the real history of our people through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it's entering into its last year of its mandate. They are hearing from the experience of residential school survivors like my own father and his brothers and sisters. And they're telling their accounts of the sexual abuse, the physical abuse. And in the memory of aunts and grandparents in my own family, relating stories about having their tongues pricked at the age of 6 as they tried to speak the only language that they knew as they went into the schools. Not a story that is unusual around the world, necessarily, about groups trying to take away, extract languages. And so just on arriving to hear about the work that's going on language retention. And in fact, the retention of the Gaelic language in Eastern Seaboard, I credit to the resurgence of the Mi'kmaq language in that same area, about people being fiercely proud of and wanting to overcome efforts for language and culture and a connection to land, territory, time with the elders. This is what the residential schools did, ripping young ones from their homes at an early age, setting them off to church-run, government-sanctioned schools with the entire premise to kill the Indian in the child, to inculcate and pour in something different. Well, I can say that in the 1870s, when Canada was moving to expand the railway west, efforts at forced starvation were part of the policy of Sir John A. Macdonald at the time. These are stories they're not in, that are just making their way into Canadian curriculum about the real history of Canada when it came these great accomplishments like moving of a railroad across the country, opening up for settlement and for trade and commerce, sexual violence and forced starvation happening in the prairies, 40,000 or so people living on the reserves that have been created up until then. Well, as you've said, as you've heard here, we are on a significant comeback trail in population. And it's got its dark side. But there's no question that we're not only here to stay, but that we're growing incredibly in numbers. But it also means that a child like this might be living in a one-room home like that. And I remember one 10-year-old who said to me, he gave this notion back to me. I didn't ask him the question because I felt the same way. It's like looking in the mirror. I could tell he didn't feel poor, just like I didn't feel poor. There was lots of trauma, for sure, plenty of violence. Children shouldn't have to take care of incapacitated adults. At the time, we didn't know that our parents, aunts and uncles had been subjected to this kind of trauma in the residential schools. And of course, we know trauma feeds trauma. And we are at an important juncture now where we're going to break the cycle. And I've got 2 children in my family that are living proof that cycle is being broken. But these stories are being told. And the intergenerational passing along of trauma is not a cycle that we've broken, but we intend to. The rest of Canadians are now starting to recognize that this is their story too. Not well understood, these communities, villages are very often across the inlet, across the railroad tracks, across the river. Some are over there, but not really necessarily understanding one another. The way the treaties, in fact, describe explicitly in Treaty 3, it says, you provide the opportunity for me to teach your children about who I am, if you'd allow that. And then we'll do the same back and forth. So that we can understand one another. So that we can care for one another. In fact, demonstrate love. That we would love one another. That is what I hear, the refrain of the elders in our communities, wherever I go, in whatever language. And in a time like this, when we're commemorating the 250th anniversary in 2013, we've gone from the 1960s when we had 12 Indigenous students in school in the entire country. 12. We now have 30,000 post-secondary graduates amongst Indigenous peoples. It's an explosion of success that we're experiencing. I have to add, though, nowhere near the success rates of the mainstream population. I want to make that point clear. This is success not because of supports, despite it. It's that fierce resilience that I'm talking about, as well as the explosion in our population. In the 1970s, we had a 14% K-12 graduation rate up to grade 12 in the primary, secondary. It's now just under 50%. It's around 49% our graduation rate. Our incarceration rate amongst young people is just over 50%. That's our current reality. That's the pattern of the trauma feeding the trauma that we're working hard. And that's the reason why, as was expressed at the outset, education is a top priority, not just for me. My father fiercely challenged it. I know there's some thesis, PhD thesis. Somebody just finished their thesis. I was celebrating with you very briefly, right here. Congratulations again, 2 days ago. Feels good to hand it in. I know there's a few others who know that feeling. Well, my father would remind me when he was taking his 3 degrees at the University of British Columbia. That's why I met Nancy in high school. Plus, she's good at math, and I was bad at math. Two cracks at math. That's another story. But my dad pursued his higher learning because he knew this was going to be his responsibility. We have one foot firmly planted in his and our identity as a Hausitz, as part of the Hausitz nation. But he challenged that institution of higher learning, University of British Columbia, experiencing the racism firsthand, experiencing the discrimination against him, that he couldn't do it, he's too stupid. That's what our people have been told over the course of history. You can't do it. You're not smart enough. Even at the time of the 1870s, they wouldn't give the people medicine for tuberculosis because they were naturally inclined to the disease. Those notions and those sentiments, the threads of those still exist in Canadian society today. We find evidence in policy, in legislation, in the behaviors of the nation state. So I give great credit to my father doing his 3 degrees. And when it came time for the master's thesis defense, he said, "Give me your toughest. I don't want anything easy here. You give me what you got." And the point that he's trying to make to me, to our community as a hereditary chief, was our people have just as much potential for genius, just as much potential to succeed in anything we set our mind and our hearts to, contrary to what we've been told. Those who study Indigenous politics would also suggest that we're equally human and we can be equally foolish too. In other words, the full range of human capacities exist, along with artistic brilliance, which is maybe Joel will touch on that for all of us a little bit later. So now we've got images like this. 30,000 Indigenous post-secondary graduates, intelligent, able to speak very often their Indigenous language and operate in the halls of power, stand toe-to-toe with any legal, any profession, including the legal concepts we're talking about. The eruption of, through social media and Facebook, the new electronic moccasin grapevine, as it were. Young people analyzing what Atleo said at the University in Scotland the other day. These sentiments will be transmitted immediately, and I get the feedback pretty quick. I get the what fors, or well done, or make sure you add this in next time, or you forgot about this. It's instant. It's lightning fast. It happens with federal legislation, commentary, political commentary of any kind. Pieces that you might write on these subjects will get picked up, they'll get transmitted, and there'll be debates about it. And if we feel that we need to, we'll stand on Parliament Hill, marching with 4,000 people in images like this, making sure that the Parliament that we're standing in front of knows that there are outstanding relationship issues that we've got with the Crown, that these issues are not separate, they're not the other, they're not only about First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. By virtue of the Royal Proclamation, the treaties, the UN Declaration, and the Wampum, what we're saying is these are your issues too. This story is Canada's story. And it's not just the story of 2 founding nations, the French and the English. It's the story of over 50 proud Indigenous nations. And the relationship has gone deeply awry. Those are the ones that give me all the hope. You can tell that I keep gravitating to spend time with the kids. That they would be supported to reach their full potential. In terms of the path forward, I had no intention to become national chief, and that's when I first became national chief. I had an interest in being a chef, and I still do. A restaurateur, perhaps. And that's my late granny. Her name was Elsie. She was 87 when she passed on. And she raised 17 children, 15 of which she bore herself, outlived 3 husbands. And she would say things like, "Grandson, I never spent a day on welfare." We're talking tough. You want the picture of resilience? That's it right there. And I remember sitting with her in the House of Commons listening to Prime Minister Paul Harper offer up an apology in 2008 to the residential school survivors, of which she's one. And her eldest child is my dad, Dr. Richard Atleo. And she said to me, when she heard the Prime Minister speak, as well as the opposition leader, bless his heart, I miss late Jack Layton, he was the leader of the NDP, and the other leaders that spoke that day, they moved us and they moved the country. It was the first time that people like my late grandmother had heard any semblance of reflection of an apology, that every one of her children were ripped from her grasp, her loving grasp, by the state and sent to schools where people like my dad went for 12 years. The deep disconnection that her generations have had to overcome. We're talking about education used as an instrument of oppression, of disconnection, of removal, of an effort to take an entire culture away. This is why there is a current debate about cultural genocide right now in Canada, being led in large part by leaders from the Canadian Jewish Congress. They're reflecting back on this history in Canada, and they're saying Canada stands as a beacon of human rights around the world, often recognized as a champion, but there is a grave human rights crisis right now in Canada. Some of those marching figures on Parliament Hill are because there are currently over 600 murdered missing Indigenous women and girls. And if this were to be happening in some of the wealthy enclaves outside of Toronto, you better believe that there would be an inquiry called, as so often is the case. This is the challenge that we face, those threads of not seeing the other I was referring to earlier. And so we are unabashedly, unreservedly, and we will not stop until we achieve a full National Public Commission of Inquiry on the issue of murdered missing women and girls. I have one such relative that was found buried, and her body parts were found on a pig farm just outside Vancouver. A massive inquiry took place in the downtown east side of Vancouver. So this is a current crisis or issue that Canada faces right now. To the government's credit, and they work with the opposition parties, and before Parliament was prorogued, because it's just returning, speech from the throne is happening next week, they struck up an all-party committee to address the issue of violence against Indigenous women and girls, and I give them credit. That was a move that was welcome. We want to see them go further, though. We want this light shone into the deepest, darkest shadows, corners of this issue and of the challenges we face in the country. It deserves nothing less, because there are structural challenges that have to be faced up to. And any of you who've gone through a personal challenge knows that there's no easy way to do it. Writing that thesis, there is no shortcut. There is no easy way. Not paint by numbers. This is digging deep. You do it at an individual level to accomplish something, and it's hard because it means a lot. The meaning here runs very deep as well. It's not just about pointing fingers, one way or the other, for that matter. It's about saying we made an original promise. And the way Indigenous peoples often feel is the way Stephen Point, a former judge, he's a Grand Chief, he said, blaming the Indigenous peoples in Canada for their plight, the deep poverty they experience, these challenges, is like breaking the leg of a man one day and blaming him for limping the following day. That's the experience that Indigenous peoples will often suggest, that you're blaming the victim for the kinds of conditions that we're living under. And so now we have an important holding up of the mirror opportunity, in part why we're traveling and spending time with you, but also the United Nations Special Rapporteur, his name is James Anaya, just arrived in Canada 2 days ago. He's on a tour across the country. He'll be meeting with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and hearing firsthand what their experiences are. I'm thankful for this, and I give credit to the Canadian government for supporting and welcoming his visit. It took a long time and a lot of lobbying, and that's part of what I do. I advocate. I'm not the head. I'm not the Indian Prime Minister. Let me just put that out there explicitly. I am not the Prime Minister of First Nations in Canada. I am an advocate. I work for the leaders of First Nations governments. My obligation and responsibility is to compel the Canadian government to get back to talking to First Nations, the likes of which you've seen in interactions where that wampum belt was being presented on a nation-to-nation basis. That was always the promise, and we have that foursquare and front and center with the Prime Minister in the meeting that I showed you the picture of last January, and another meeting that we had this January 11th. A very different meeting, though. The backdrop to the meeting this January was a woman, a chief, on a hunger strike, and 4,000 protesters circling the Prime Minister's office. And difficult decisions made by leaders like me. Do you go inside and sit down with the Prime Minister when the relationship feels so that it's gone so awry? Not easy decisions, but I'll tell you, I wouldn't make a different decision as I stand with you. I and the majority of my executive went in. We called for that meeting. We sat down with the Prime Minister, and we put these issues in front of him, the issue of murder and missing Indigenous women and girls. And we've seen some progress, but we expect more. We put treaty implementation on the table. He committed to a treaty implementation process. We have some areas like Treaty 3 in Northern Ontario that are going to test that political will, and they're going to those tables. We have reforming the land negotiations framework in Canada, which has not even kept pace with the wins that we've achieved in the courts. They say in Canada we have the longest, biggest legal winning streak going around the world. We're on 150 court cases that have been won, including the fishing case. That is my case in my own village. So we're challenging Canada even in the domestic courts. The rule of law has not only not been supported, it sure has not been implemented. It's by and large been, if we win, the state ignores it and goes about the business of establishing policy and legislation anyway. Again, quite contrary to what the original intention was. So in terms of where to go from here and as a way to close this out and have a conversation, the way forward. I've talked about the challenges that we're facing, our realities, some of the areas of priority, including pieces like education, which I actually am more hopeful standing here with you today than I was 3 days ago about the possibilities of something transformational happening in education in Canada. Our children receive $2,000 to $7,000 less per child for education than do Canadians in the mainstream regular education system. We need 60 schools today. We only have 20 libraries serving over 600 communities. The gap is deep, and it requires a real investment in funding, and it requires a real commitment that we would invest in the young people to achieve success. It requires that we be structurally seen the way it was expected at the Royal Proclamation. When my grandmother was holding my hand, she said, "Grandson, they're just beginning to see us. They're just beginning to see us." That was 2008, not that long. The path forward has really three main elements. The first is the empowerment of our nations and our communities. This means capacity support, projects that focus on sustainable economic development, social issues, the full range of the social determinants of how community housing. We need 80,000 homes right now to respond to the needs of kids like Jaden, who is living with his family, around 9 of them in the 20 by 30 foot one-room home. We need infrastructure, like clean drinking water. Over 100 communities are exposed to unsafe drinking water. The second area is a real focus on a new conservation or regenerative economy. That's the vision I was alluding to a number of times before. Canada right now, there's huge pressure to build pipelines, to extract resources, and to ship them to natural resource-hungry economies in places like Asia. Well, First Nations are right in the middle of every proposed project. We will have a say. The moment right now is one of either, as I've said in speeches recently back home, it's one of collaboration based on the principles that we've been talking about, or it's going to be collision in the courts and on the land, and it's happening. Natural gas, fracking. I understand those debates are happening in this part of the world as well. The shipment of heavy oils, bitumen. Those are real-time discussions happening right now back home in Canada, especially in my home province of British Columbia. And we are inserting our vision, and we will insert it, not just domestically in Canada, but working backwards from November 2014. There's going to be a World Indigenous Conference hosted by the United Nations. The Indigenous peoples around the world are networked, we are linked, and we will help shape a new vision to emerge for sustainability. So a new conservation economy is required. And 3, real shared decision-making, and importantly, this is getting past the finger-pointing part, is real shared accountability. It was always about a full relationship, mutual respect and recognition. That we equally, of course, as we would want, as any family would want, full education supports for our children, just like any child within the boundaries of Canada, because walk, because we are absolutely all connected. So those 3 main areas, empowering nations, a new conservation economy, a regenerative economy. My son describes it as dad regenerative. Why? Because Grandpa took me down to the ocean when we had our first fish of the year and put the bones back in the ocean. Let go, let go. We thank the Creator. We thank the fish for giving up its life, that we would have sustenance, that we could live another day, that it transformed its spirit for me. We put the bones down because we recognize our connection to where it comes from. But it's also fertilizing the environment. So, Dad, we need to pursue a regenerative economy. That's what Grandpa and my late grandpa had taught me, and that's what his grandpa had taught him, about understanding how deeply connected we are with the living environment. And our stories have this, and we have teachings and cultures around the world that help remind us of this. So I appreciate being here to recognize the link between the ceremony of the fish of my son in the little village of Ahousaht and the important work that's going on here in your university and your studies and the things that you're contemplating. I know this is a very global university as well, people from all around the world. And that sense or sentiment about us being interconnected is all the more important at a moment like this as we're faced with challenges, environmental see a strong outcome at the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples next November. And make no mistake that if you choose, you can make a significant contribution and exert your power and influence as leading thinkers and scholars and influencers on the reconciliation work that's required between First Nations communities and Canada and Indigenous peoples and their nation states. And I'll leave with this last thought and this last image. 3 weeks ago, Nancy and I were in the pouring rain in Vancouver, as it's wont to do, probably like it does here a bit. And we were marching with 75,000 people. Unprecedented gathering, focused on reconciliation. It's called the Walk for Reconciliation. And we listened to Dr. Bernice King, echoing the sentiments, the passion of her late father, Dr. Martin Luther King, who 50 years ago gave his famous I Have a Dream speech in front of 250,000 on the issue of civil rights. And while the issues are different, there's certainly parallels. And she challenged Canada. This is no time for lip service. This is a time for life service. She didn't use those phrases exactly like her dad did when it came to this point. But what she captured when she challenged and confronted Canada in front of 75,000 people to achieve the social and economic justice that the Royal Proclamation, that treaties had always promised, it captured for me what I'm feeling about this moment with you in this lecture hall, in this room, in this country, is what Dr. Martin Luther King captured 50 years ago, and that is the fierce urgency of now. We're not going to punt this down another generation. We're not waiting for a white-knighted, on a white horse, prime minister to show up one day and treat us with respect. We're calling on all treaty peoples and citizens, and by extension, that reaches out to you. Because we have a relationship that endures, that goes back 250 years. Ceremonies were done. Ancestors said that we would be side by side, respecting each other, holding each other up, expressing care and love, and demonstrating through our actions how much we are connected. So with that, thank you so much for the great privilege of sharing a few thoughts with you on the anniversary of the Royal Proclamation. Teko, teko. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much indeed for your comments. Chief Atleo has said that he's happy to take questions from people in the audience. So if people would like to ask questions, can you just let me know? Sarah, do you want to just start off? I think it's going to be quite complicated. I'd love to hear your voice, I think, but we can repeat the question.
All right.
Firstly, thank you very much for speaking with me. I spent the last 4 years working with First Nations and Métis seniors in Canadian cities in Calgary and Winnipeg. And coming from a position within academia, I found it concerning the almost entire lack of interest from the academic community on Aboriginal seniors, and particularly with working with Aboriginal seniors' own ways of knowing to better understand. My field is healthcare. Working with their own ways of knowing to better understand their experiences of healthcare. I understand the need for the intense focus on younger groups within Aboriginal communities, but I was wondering if you could speak to the needs of older people as well, because within academic settings, which so often lead healthcare practices, they are almost entirely forgotten.
Absolutely. And the question was around the role of elders and acknowledging the focus on young people, but to comment on the role of elders in healthcare in particular, and the lack of attention in the academic community and some dismay, which I share. And so I've got one of my great aunties there, Flossie, that helps as my point of reference. I think about, the fact that Flossie tells me stories about being taken as a child from her grandparents, and now she's a grandmother and a grandaunt to me, and she's one of the matriarchs in our family. She is one of the reasons why I'm standing with you here. As a child, when we stopped the residential school experience, she would be be one of the ones that the aunties would come up to me and say, "Have you gone to see your nan today?" And I would be on my way to go fishing. I had my fishing line in this pocket, my dry fish in this pocket, and I'd be like, "I just want to go play with my friends." And I would be instructed to go visit my nans. And they would sit and they would hymn with me. They would tell me stories in our language. And when I talk about the social determinants of health, I'm talking about the full spectrum of care for an individual, removing the unsafe notion. We've got deeply unsafe conditions. When you have over 600 murdered missing Indigenous women and girls, you have much more than just not the involvement between generations. You've got a deeply traumatized situation. So part of the answer is emerging in places like Atlantic Canada. I use the Gaelic Mi'kmaq experience in the eastern seaboard. What they've done there is they've built schools with the elder center next to the preschool center, right in the school. Very focused reconnection of generations that for 7 generations, every effort was to remove them. A second example includes the High Commissioner from Canada to London. His name is Gordon Campbell. He's the former Premier of British Columbia. I worked with Premier Campbell when I was regional chief for BC. We forged an agreement called the Transformative Change Accord. Health was one of the factors. The UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples says that we and my people have a right to implement health approaches based on our perspective, as well as to implement the treaty right to health. Treaty number 6 has the most explicit references to health. So to have health delivery based on a First Nations perspective means that the resources are required as well. Canada transfers on an annual basis. There's a 6% increase on health transfers between the federal government and the provinces and territories on an annual basis. 6% for health, 6% for education. First Nations have been under a 2% cap since 1996. So there's been no ability and no increase in resources in areas like health to give effect to the right to reconnect generations and have the elders involved in driving it. So the successes that I can point to are not because of the support, but in fact in spite of it. For communities are just finding a way to do it. And lastly on health, October 1st, a historic moment occurred. The responsibility for health in First Nations in British Columbia, 203 First Nations, 32 languages, was transferred. It's no longer at the Minister of Health's responsibility in Ottawa. Jurisdictional, right? I mentioned those 3 areas. Shared decision-making was the 3rd area that I described. That's just been achieved in British Columbia on health. So the 203 are in charge of their own health. 400 million just got transferred, so real resources. So I wanted to just point out that the gap remains so deep, but we can find markers of progress. And then we went and shipped them off to London. And now we got a new leader, and we're back to square one again. That's that old partisan, being implicated with the Democratic Party system in Canada. We're extremely challenged by that, but the odd light does come along. I'm not saying that Gordon was good on everything. Don't quote me now. Hang on a second. We were definitely challenged, and we had a lot of these, him and I. But you also need to respect and give credit and respect where progress does occur. And great progress was made in health. It's an important reflection.
Okay, well, the other, yes. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Oh no, it's fine.
What is it?
My name's Amy Robertson.
Hi.
Hiya, I'm a social anthropology student. So first of all, I'd like to give my greatest thanks for you for coming along. It was, as you said, like a great honour to hear you speak, definitely. So to put it into kind of wider context, I've been working for the past couple of years with Tibetan communities, which, as I see you're very aware of, obviously that's very much parallels with the issues faced by your communities, in that their homeland is obviously experiencing great cultural genocide and also more recently extreme environmental violation to their cultural lands, which is why I am so appreciative to hear about the World Indigenous Conference and to hear about people creating a vision for Indigenous worldviews on the environment, which I believe the sooner that our governments listen to this sustainability method, like the better basically for everyone. But my concern is, as you said, that with stuff like this conference coming up and us as outsiders do have a role to play, my concern in this movement is how do we use our position to work in solidarity with Indigenous people without co-opting their voice, which is undoubtedly like who we need to listen to. So.
I think you just turned that into a statement.
Yeah. Sorry.
If people didn't hear, how you support what's been heard, and not everybody does. I have lots of people who hold strong contrary views to what I've just shared with you. But I've asked for support. Up high stuff, it's one of the deepest of our teachings. That if you need a cup of sugar, that it would be disrespectful if you're my neighbor not to be friendly and ask you for that cup of sugar. It's just about relationships. And I guess I'm asking you for a cup of sugar. We need support. And asking you to look in your heart and to think about what might be a good way to offer it. The fact that you even know to say that you'd like to do it and not co-opt it suggests a consciousness about human relationships, both structural and informal, that make me feel very appreciative and full of gratitude that you would even offer that up. Now in Canada, I can offer a lot of specific suggestions or examples. Non-government organizations that would build clean water systems in Africa are now asking Indigenous communities in Canada how they can support them. We have Habitat for Humanity that builds homes around the world in places like Haiti, now building homes in First Nations communities. Nancy and I bumped into Mike Holmes of Homes on Homes fame, a famous home building show. I think it's global. And we saw him in Copenhagen on our way to that, and Nan said he should be building at home. He's helping to rebuild an Indigenous community in Northern Ontario. I can point to now increasingly example after example of people who've worked in the developing world now recognizing that in their own backyard, because of this not seeing one another and the finger pointing and the blaming that's been going on for so long, and the fact that a lot of our people don't participate, so we don't show up in the political structures. So we have to reach out to the majority and say, look, we aren't the other. We're in this together. We're trying to have this so that our children are raised, and we're finding convergence on value issues like the environment. It's like sustainability. There's powerful convergence there where whether it's the oil sands or tar sands, depending which side of the politics you fall on, they'll state one. And your positions become fairly clear. But the challenge here is not so much we just want help responding to a proposal to stop it. It's about a new vision emerging. So the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples can be about you as an individual reaching out. You can go to the AFN website, afn.ca, and see some of our partners like Free the Children, Mark and Craig Kilberger, who are addressing child slavery in Asia when he was, I think he was 9 years old. He became a global phenomenon. He was invited to the offices of power. I was talking to Dr. Mark about this, about the upcoming event in Warsaw. What number is it, Doctor? It's 19. We've lost count, right? It's like so many. And Indigenous leaders will be there. And I think it's a matter of having those conversations. But your point of entry, depending on where you come from, is in what I described. You all have a legitimate structural point of entry. And it's in these treaties and documents that were forged, not just with the British. It's with the Dutch. It's with the French. And by extension, of course, it's through the country. And it's about being a global citizen. And by supporting First Nations in Canada, I suggest that we can then become real global actors for human and Indigenous rights around the world. That in Guatemala, the Indigenous peoples are being dispossessed of their land to make way for natural resources, that we can stand with them. But we can do so with congruence because our nation state's working with us in an appropriate way. Or places like India, where we might not think about Indigenous people's rights. I marched with 24,000 who represent 80 million Adivasi landless poor who are being dispossessed of their lands because of principally Western multinationals that are thirsty for resources. So it's not just a Canadian issue, not just a First Nations issue, it's a global Indigenous peoples, and I think it's a global citizenry issue.
Yes, hello. Sorry, what's your name?
Beth.
Beth, hi, and what do you do?
Social anthropology.
Great.
Sorry,
Welcome.
I've lost my voice a bit. Both in Scotland and in Canada, people are protesting against shale gas fracking. I was wondering if you could tell us your position on the gas fracking in New Brunswick and your plan of action for the issue.
Did somebody send you that from the protest site? Do you see how this works now? You see how this works, and that's the brilliance and the power of this moment. The dissonance. Yeah, the question is, what's my position on the shale gas exploration happening in New Brunswick, and what action am I going to take? I love that question. It's exactly what I'm reflecting is the moment we're in. And in part, my answer is demonstrated by both my conversations with the Dalai Lama, as well as singing a song on the Wall of China, and standing with tribal peoples in the hearts of China that don't speak the two major languages. They have their own indigenous language. And they were drumming, and I was drumming. And our spiritual leaders were having exchanges. And it's the point I made earlier that one of the challenges that we face, and I'm certainly not afraid to state my position, one of the challenges we face, though, is that has been part of our pattern problem. Is what's your position on that exploration or that development? What's your position on the Northern Gateway project? Are you for or are you against it? Do you call it the tar sands or do you call it the oil sands? Because then I can situate you in your and my politics. I just want to stress that point, first of all. Why I was so excited to be here and talk to Dr. Mark is that my daughter is interested in what she would refer to. One of the programs is ecological economics. And really my question is around what's our plan or vision for energy? And how does this fracking, shale gas exploration, how does it fit into it? Because what it's done for my people is I sat in a circle of principally women. Just like the auntie, remember I told you the story? They did the same thing to me when I was in New Brunswick at Elsie-Bukta. You better come sit down with us, just like when I was a kid. So I went and I sat in a circle, Nancy and I went. They didn't allow any other men, it was just me. So, but I had one woman who had my back guaranteed right there. And they're there at the protest site. They're saying that what's happening, they don't know enough about it. So there's a literacy issue on energy that we've not been supported. Our right to free, prior, and informed consent, the UN Declaration minimum acceptable standard. I am 100% behind the people in Elsie-Bukta standing up against shale gas exploration. Not necessarily for the reasons that you might think. We don't know enough about it. I was also against fish farming when it got draped in our territories. Fish farming happens off the coasts here and off the coasts of places like Norway. Atlantic salmon. The elders said to me, Atlantics, do they know this is the Pacific? They've got the wrong ocean. These fish are in the wrong place. I think it's about asking the right questions. I think that's an important question, and I'm not afraid to take political positions and suggest that the way forward, and we've done things about it. We've pressed for the New Brunswick Premier, and there's been meetings, and they've struck up a working group. And so the role of the provincial and federal governments now is all the more apparent. They cannot just ignore us. I was telling you that earlier. And the last point on this piece is just how far now Canada's come in acknowledging that we're a force to be reckoned with. In 2005, Canada's Department of Natural Resources said that 5 to 6 billion, at the time this sounded like a lot, 5 to 6 billion in natural resource development aspirations in Canada were going to be implicated by First Nations communities like Elsie-Bukta. That number has been updated a little bit in 2013. There's thinking that has emerged that has changed the perspective. Now Canada is saying there's 650 billion in natural resource development projects that Canada aspires to, that my people are implicated. In other words, I said earlier that we would express our vision. It's kind of a gentle way of saying sometimes people will stand up and they'll say no to a project because we've been put in the difficult position of having to answer to a specific project because we've been not invited, the way the Royal Proclamation and the treaty said that we should share in creating a vision for what economics looks like, not just in New Brunswick, not just in the Atlantic, but what about the geopolitics of oil and energy, the relationship with South America? What about the pipeline discussions in the United States? I held an international Indigenous Energy and Mining Summit two and a half years ago, anticipating that I would get questions like this, that the poor people of Elsie-Bukta would have to do what they're doing. So we've arrived at a moment, I'll say it again, collaboration or collision. And the leaders of business and industry, they've got a responsibility too. Many of them are going, well, that's not my job. That's up to the Premier and the federal government to decide with their regulatory processes that one can study under Dr. Mark, often having no relationship to one another and jurisdictions that don't talk to one another either. So I hope you can feel the sense of both resolve that we and my people have, that we'll stand up, but that there are structural challenges that underpin this that's where the connection is with people globally. That's where the supports come and where we find linkages. We can link arms and become allies like we always were, going back to the battlefields in the 7-Year War.
Yeah. What is your name?
Sylvia.
Sylvia. Yeah.
Quick, Mr. Atleo. The question actually came from me. I spent a number of weeks in Elsipogtog, and I just came back, and I've told the people there that you would be coming to Edinburgh, and they sent me some questions they would like me to ask on their behalf. And actually, yeah, it's just one, really. It's just a few issues. One of my friends has sent me the question yesterday. An injunction was put against her by AFN, and a lot of people have been arrested, despite the protest has been peaceful.
When were they arrested?
Since April it started the arrests,
right.
And since I believe 33 arrests so far. And there's been just very recently, I'm not sure about the numbers, but there has been more arrests and more injunctions recently. So I'm wondering what could you do to stop the arrests, or to also. You were there in July, and you said, give us time, give me time, was your response to them asking you for help. And you said you could provide lawyers, and they complained to me, or they said that all they heard from you really was a letter, and they haven't received any support in the form of lawyers. Now you mentioned that you have also engaged in lobbying, but the Signatog woman who you said you were sitting with, they're asking, when are you going to... You promised them on the 1st of July you're going to support them more, and they're asking, when are you going to do that, and what can they expect you to do?
This is wonderful. In Elsipogtog, you would know that the group that you're talking with, what's the name of the person that you're talking with? Can you share that?
Amy Sock and Willie Nolan. Yeah.
And they had some disconnections in the beginning with the chief, with the local government.
Yeah.
And not uncommon in Indigenous communities. My role as an advocate is to support First Nations governments. I don't have the authority to overstep the rights of the Elsipogtog people or government. So that's the first piece. When I'm invited by governments to provide advocacy, as I was done both by the people of Elsipogtog and the chief that day, we've carried through with the requests that were made. The offers of legal support from my office, I've got lawyers, and advocacy support when requested. That includes pressing for the Premier to respond, and I understand a meeting did take place.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know what the outcome of that meeting is. I heard that there was a working group set up,
yeah,
or whether or not it's got the support of the grassroots protesters. That piece I don't know. So in this respect, I know only as much as I've heard through the media. And in terms of what you can do, we have direct experience with this in Clydewood Sound. There were over 800 people arrested, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples alike, and it's a similar situation as Elsipogtog. In that situation, similarly, the provincial premier came in quite dramatically, actually, by helicopter, and established what was called the Clydewood Sound Science Panel. And you can research this. You can see that what it created was, and this is something Dr. Mark and I were talking about briefly, is it established Indigenous knowledge situated side by side with science to establish a new management regime that got us away from this idea of just responding to clear-cut logging and whether or not you support it or not. Or do you support fracking in New Brunswick and Elsipogtog or not? It created a new land management regime, was the result. So that's one such example. So there are precedents. There are ways forward. It's going to have to be led by the people of Elsipogtog and their government,
yeah,
and as well as support from an indirect involvement, political involvement of the premier. So I was pleased to see, because I think that was one of the things that they were looking for, was direct political engagement. The second aspect is that of the police, or the RCMP, and it comes back to why I'm here. The 2 Row Wampum talks about the laws of one, not intersecting with or impeding the laws of the other. You see, the LC Buktuk are upholding their laws, but being persecuted for obstructing with the laws of the other. That's the problem that we've got. And it's a real one. It's why we've got treaty implementation on the table with the Prime Minister. So the interest here would be if the Mi'kmaq people, and I understand there is interest at the senior leadership level, to establish a treaty implementation table. The Mi'kmaq Treaty is 400 years old.
Yeah. There
is no treaty implementation mechanism in 2013. That, folks, is why the LC Buktuk people, they don't have a shale gas problem. They don't have a relationship with business or industry problem. They have a non-implementation of treaty problem. That's the problem for the country. And so I'm excited and don't know the story about why or how you ended up there. But you see its implications here, and working backwards from the World Indigenous Conference and finding solutions that support Indigenous peoples to go drive a vision for things like energy and not be forced to say yes or no to a project that they didn't support it being implemented in the first place. Then placing me in the position, and leaders by and large in the position, we spend the vast majority of our time responding to conflict because we're not working on making this relationship work. So the legal piece is that the RCMP should not be enforcing one law over the other. They should only be upholding peace. That should be their principal objective. If the community wants support for that, I would welcome an invitation to advocate or address the role of the RCMP. We've had no such invitation on the part of the community to do that. But that's another element, is to address that. And that was in part the offer of the legal conversation that I don't know why it hasn't happened, but our lawyers, at least the one lawyer that we have in my office, are ready to do that. Okay. So those are the three pieces. The support, we sent out another press release last Friday saying, Finger, you need to do something. I understand that meeting took place. Second is the RCMP should be there, and this is something that's unique on Indigenous rights. They're not there to implement and enforce the laws of the Crown over the Indigenous peoples. They just should be there to keep the peace. And thirdly is moving towards treaty implementation, where all those people are involved and having the right to say no if they choose, because the right to free, prior, and informed consent, but also the responsibility for the successor state to implement the treaty that was forged even before Canada was formed. That implicates this room. That's an excellent question. It's not just up to me, though.
Thank you. Yes, so we haven't got time for very much more, so can I just ask you, what's your name?
Yeah, Josh.
Josh, hi.
Hi.
We're going to stop just after this minute.
In a lot of the programs and courses that they offer here, we talk about participatory development models as well as the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge into ecological monitoring and conservation work. And you mentioned in your presentation about how NGOs who have been working in Africa and in Asia and working there, they've also been trying to incorporate Indigenous knowledge there. And we've talked a lot in our courses about the challenges and a lot of criticisms regarding those models. So I was wondering if you'd be able to speak to and elaborate on the experiences of the Indigenous communities that are now working with these NGOs on infrastructure projects.
I think there's been some experiences that might parallel the developing world. In other words, we have the solution, and we're going to fix you up. I think there's a greater awareness that hasn't worked in other parts of the world, and that it's got to be about, as I said at the outset, about empowerment. The three elements that I talked about. So first and most importantly is the empowerment. We're seeing that there's a greater awareness now that you sit down with the leaders and you share and develop a vision. If you've got something to offer, it's welcome, especially if there's been an invitation. And increasingly there are invitations for the needs. A young boy in southern Ontario building a playground in Attawaka's Camp, made famous because that's where Chief Teresa Spence comes from, where she's chief. Or a woman giving something like $250,000 for education because she knows the story about that. Those would have normally been resources that go elsewhere around the world. The philanthropic community in Canada is now turning their attention. And I think there's a shared sense in groups like the Aboriginal Circle of Philanthropy, where the voices of Indigenous peoples are being brought into this equation. And they're being invited to co-create an approach. That was the original treaty. That was the original proclamation. So it's very much the same concept that's emerging in Canada. But admittedly, there are some experiences that do feel like First Nations are just seen as the other who need to be helped. This is about a hand up, not a handout. Former Prime Minister Paul Martin is a great example. He's got a national initiative empowering and supporting First Nations entrepreneurship, especially with young people. And they're being welcomed and they're being integrated and led by First Nations themselves, principally young people, we're finding, because they've got the energy. They're linked, as we've just demonstrated, around the world in real action, in real time. And I think that this moment where we're seeing 70,000 people, the faith community, unions, groups that have helped overcome social or economic justice in other areas, are gravitating quickly to Indigenous peoples and communities and forging new alliances. And there's creativity that's emerging, unlike we've seen in recent years. And it's an exciting moment. I hope I've been, if anything here, conveyed to you a sense of hope about the promise of the young people in our communities and about the potential that we've got to bring this relationship back to what its original intention was. That idea of mutual respect, real friendship, understanding one another. My hope is that Canada is going to be a leader. We have a huge challenge because of the natural resource-based industry and this government's focus on seeking to maximize. But in great moments of the biggest challenges often emerge the biggest opportunities. So this is not a time to, like with the finishing of a master's thesis, think that there's an easy way out of the in Canada. This is not a moment to go for a skate and think that it's going to be a single solution from on high somewhere that's going to make it right. This is about digging in deep and going hard and challenging the citizens of countries like Canada to say, you're a part of this. This is your story too. We need you to bring your energy, your spirit, your good faith, your goodwill, your intellect, your preparedness to challenge both your own feelings and thoughts as well as others. Not only have a good debate, this is the era of action. That's what they're doing in Elsipogtog. This is not a theoretical conversation on the ground there. This is the era of action that we've embarked on, and our people will lead the way. We want to do it together, though. We want to do it in the spirit of the Royal Proclamation, of the treaties, and this promise of peace and harmony between peoples and between people in the living environment. That's what drives me. That's what I'm so thankful to arrive here and my wife's ancestral tribal homelands to say that we're in this together. And I look forward to the work that you're going to be. I'll be keeping an eye on the graduates of the University of Edinburgh and various programs I've heard about and the contributions that you're going to make and maybe see the splash that will occur as a result of our conversation at the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples next year. Just one more reminder. I think we're done for time.
We are.
So thank you very much.
Yeah. Chief Atleo, I would just like to thank you so much on behalf of the Centre of Canadian Studies and the Global Justice Academy here for coming to speak to us. I think we're...
You offered some pointers, and one important method that kept coming up again when I spoke to people there was to listen. To really listen, sounds kind of cheesy, but it's true, to listen to what Indigenous peoples have to say about their lives and needs. Today, by welcoming the National Chief, we've had a particular chance to do just that. Another important method is to educate ourselves about the ongoing legacies of British colonialism, which, with the Centre of Canadian Studies here in Edinburgh, we all have a rare opportunity to do. I urge you to get involved, and again, I extend a huge thank you to the Chief and his wife Nancy, and say, "Fleck up, fleck up."